Later this month, the United States Department of Defense is set to release a trove of documents. They pertain to what might be the most obsessively discussed and imagined topic they've ever investigated: unexplained aerial phenomena, or as we usually say, UFOs. Canadian Air Force pilots have also reported sightings, and if serious people are now finally talking about this, well then, so are we. To do that, let's welcome, in Pasadena, California, Amy Shira Teitel, spaceflight historian and author of Fighting for Space: Two Pilots and Their Historic Battle for Female Spaceflight. On Manhattan Island in New York City, Ralph Blumenthal. He was a reporter with the New York Times for more than 4 decades and is author of The Believer: Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and the Passion of John Mack. In Winnipeg, Manitoba, Chris Rutkowski, a science writer who runs the blog Ufology Research. And in the annex neighborhood of Ontario's capital city, there's Daniel Otis, freelance journalist who has written for publications such as Vice, the Toronto Star, and the Globe and Mail. And we're delighted to welcome all 4 of you onto TVO's airwaves tonight. And, okay, Chris, first question, what's that little thing over your right shoulder? We're a serious show here. What is that thing?
Well, that, of course, is the Reddit alien that everybody knows is called SNU, as in what's new with you. It's one of those things where people are always, they want to get me something because of my UFO interest for Father's Day or birthdays or whatever. So it's always something, whether it's Marvin or anything like that.
I gotcha. Okay. Ralph, I'd like to start with you if I could, because it was your piece, I guess, in the New York Times about 3.5 years ago that essentially broke the story that the Pentagon was investigating unidentified flying objects, as they were then called. All right, refresh our memories. What did you find out back then?
Well, we found out there was a secret unit in the Pentagon called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ATIP, that was funded starting in 2007 with $22 million, which is a drop in the bucket in the Pentagon budget, to research these unexplained encounters that Navy pilots and sailors were having with objects. We found out, we at the New York Times, I and 2 colleagues found out that this unit had been studying this phenomenon for a number of years with no disclosure to the American public. Supposedly the government was out of the UFO business with Project Blue Book at the end of 1969, but in reality, they were continuing to investigate, and that's what we reported.
These 3.5 years later, are you able to say how you got that scoop now?
Yeah, I mean, one of my colleagues, Leslie Kane, who's a noted UFO writer, got a tip that a meeting was going on in Washington, D.C. with the head of the program, Luis Elizondo, who was resigning because he was not getting enough support from the government. And his was not a household name then. It is now, of course. But Leslie went down, sat in on the meeting, came back to me, and I reported. I was a contributor to the New York Times, having left the regular reporting staff. I reported to the executive editor that we had a real scoop about the secret Pentagon office investigating UFOs, and we had it all, chapter and verse, on the record. No, anonymous sources. We had the documentation. We had Elizondo's resignation letter. And they put it on the front page on a Sunday, and as they say, the rest is history.
Indeed. One more quick follow-up on this, and that is, you said it was a $22 million program. I think the Pentagon's budget back then was something like $600 billion. So what did that tell you about what kind of commitment the Pentagon was actually making to this?
All you need to know, it was really a drop in the bucket. It was a very minor commitment. And they claimed they shut down the program 5 years later, but we know it continued in another form and continues to this day. So they were not, bannering it, but they were continuing.
Okay, with that background in place, let's now show everybody, you guys and our viewers, this was some video that the Pentagon released back in 2004. It's supposed to be an encounter between a fighter jet and, let's just call it, an unknown object. Okay, Sheldon, if you would, let's roll that.
My gosh. We're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. Look at that thing, dude. That's not our LNS though, is it? It's not. That is an LNS, dude. Well, if there's like... Look at that thing. It's rotating.
So that's video from 2004, released in 2017. And Amy, let's go to you first on this. When you saw that, what'd you think?
I thought it was pretty interesting. And very, very blurry. The thing that really stands out to me in those videos, all of these Navy videos, is that they are seen in radars, which immediately, I mean, I am the self-described skeptic, immediately makes me wonder if it couldn't be some kind of artifact. But still, nevertheless, I think it's really interesting, and I'm the one who loves to kind of take what looks unexplained and try to find the explanation. So my immediate thought is, this is neat. Let's look at how artifacts and radar might work. Let's try to, we obviously don't know all the details. We can't know all the details, but that's kind of where my mind goes first.
Daniel, where does your mind go first?
Well, I'm not an aeronautical engineer, and it's difficult for me to speak about the performance capabilities we're seeing there. But really, what really interests me with these videos is the audio, the voices. These are trained military aviators who have a pretty good idea of the things that should be in the sky, and they're expressing, shock, excitement, surprise at what they're seeing. And to me, that reaction really highlights the anomalous nature of what's depicted in these videos.
Chris, how about your reaction?
Well, when I saw it, I realized that there's something very strange going on here, but we have to parse out what the not only what the audio was saying, but also the descriptions of the objects by the pilots themselves later. And they don't match what we see in the video. In fact, one of the problems with the videos is that we don't have all the information. We don't. A lot of it has been stripped of some of its accompanying information as to when it was taken, where it was taken, so forth. And the video itself was actually kicking around on the internet years before the Pentagon released it. So there's a lot of red flags that are there. But at the same time, I agree with Amy that it is very curious, and I want to know more.
Ralph, I suppose there's the inclination to want to jump to the conclusion that it is an unidentified flying object, but is it just as equally possible that it could be some, who knows what, military thing from Russia or China or beyond?
Well, the experts that we've consulted at the New York Times have pretty much ruled that out. First of all, it's not ours, because we wouldn't be, endangering our own pilots by running these things in our own airspace where pilots are going around. Equally unlikely is that it's Russian or Chinese, because we don't think, or our best experts don't think, that they have graduated to that level. Astonishing aerodynamics, invisibility, ability to operate in the water, by the way, underwater as well as the air. So I would say, we're all skeptical, but on the other hand, catching these things on radar, on thermal imaging cameras, being eyeballed by our most highly trained observers, these pilots, really leads to the conclusion that for the first time, we can say, or experts can say with some authority, that these things exist physically. They don't know, what they are, where they come from, who's behind the wheel. They don't know anything about them. But the big breakthrough, in my view, is that they now know more or less convincingly that they exist, which they couldn't say before. They attributed to swamp gas or reflections on the desert floor from headlights or hallucinations or fly specks on the windshield, you name it. But now it looks like these things really exist. So that's something.
Chris, you've been studying UFOs for how long?
Let's say 40 years and go from there.
Okay. In your 4 decades plus of looking at these things and studying these things, how common would what we just saw be in the Canadian skies?
Well, in Canada, there are more than 1,000 reports that are recorded every year. The Canadian UFO survey that I coordinate has about 22,000 cases over the past 30 years or so. And we do get reports from pilots. We get reports from military personnel, from people in towers. They're all over the map. And most of the cases can be explained, but there's a small fraction every year that are puzzling. And a lot of them do come from pilots who are reporting things similar to what has been reported in the United States.
And Amy, we should just say you're originally from Canada. You're in California right now. How many of these things, as Chris just described them, would you say are genuinely, truly unexplainable?
Not that many, to be honest. You see a lot. I'm in LA, and we see a lot of unexplained phenomena in the sky. I get a lot of texts from friends panicking about weird things, and pretty much I look up what just launched out of Vandenberg, and it's usually you're seeing a rocket contrail or you're seeing a rocket stage go over. I think most of the time, and granted, I'm not the ufologist, but most of the time when I look into things that are unexplained, they're typically explained. They're either debris from rockets, they're aircraft that we aren't familiar with, so we're not used to seeing the shape of, so they're just aircraft. A lot of people mistake just upper atmospheric lightning. It's something that we don't see very often. That can be interpreted as a UFO. Not to mention, apparently people see planets and think they're UFOs sometimes because they're not used to the light from planets not wavering.
All right, Daniel, we talked about the U.S. Pentagon and its interest in this going back in time. How about the Canadian military? What do we know about their interest in sightings of UFOs?
Well, my understanding is that their interest is almost non-existent. The Canadian military and military personnel have been reporting things of this nature for close to 70 years, and these are at bases from coast to coast. One example would be at CFB North Bay in northeastern Ontario. There were UFO reports filed by military personnel in both 2007 and in 1952. And the case in 1952 was, genuinely the weirder one. It involved a fast-moving light that stopped and then reversed and sped away faster than anything the witnesses had ever seen. And these were Canadian Air Force personnel. So there's been a history of documentation in Canada regarding this, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of follow-up and investigation on the part of the military. They're getting these reports, but they don't really seem to be doing much with them.
Chris, is that your understanding as well?
Absolutely. In fact, what's curious is that in Canada, we actually have a more transparent military interest in UFOs, despite the fact that, as Daniel says, it doesn't seem to be they're doing much. The United States finished its Project Blue Book that many people are familiar with from the TV shows and so forth back in the 1960s. And since then, there hadn't been very much information about what the United States has been doing in terms of UFO reports and investigations and sightings until the recent Pentagon interest in the videos. So I think it's because of that we have the interest. But in Canada, we know that the National Research Council investigated UFOs in partnership with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police until about 1995. After that, Transport Canada took a role. The RCAF has been involved. But it seems like it's been a hot potato, and I think that's the biggest concern, is that nobody seems to know what to do with the UFO phenomenon.
Chris, let me do a quick follow-up with you on that. Do you think, we're living in a COVID-19 age right now, and people are reacting, some well, some not so well. Do you think COVID has had an influence in the spiking of people noticing UFOs?
Well, in fact, in 2019, we did notice an increase in the number of UFO reports. In 2020, we noticed a significant increase in the number of UFO reports. And a lot of speculation has been around whether this was regarding the pandemic. People were spending more time at home in their backyards rather than inside venues where they didn't look into the sky, and hence reporting UFOs. However, we're still in the midst of the pandemic. And in 2021 so far, the number of UFOs in Canada, actually also in the United States, has decreased quite significantly. So there's other factors at play, but there's certainly a relationship there somehow.
Amy, can I get you to weigh in on that as well? Has COVID-19 contributed to this in any way?
Possibly. It's possible that, and I think that it might have contributed more, not from what I see at least, not necessarily in sightings or people kind of seeing things, but in the interest in this. I think we're so just bogged down with COVID coverage, and there's so much negativity in the news right now. The world is kind of falling apart, that this is something that's a little bit exciting. And I think even the biggest skeptics kind of want to believe. And there's an element of excitement. There's an element of, well, all of this bad news, but we have this potential interesting UFO news coming out of the government. Maybe this will give us something exciting to focus on, something really fun that's new. I think there's a little bit of that's kind of driving a lot of the interest right now.
Well, when you say news coming out of the government, let me follow up with Ralph on that, because I do want to get your sense about how cooperative the government and or the Pentagon truly is, how transparent they're truly being in helping the public understand what's going on right now. What's your sense of it?
Well, they've had a bad history. They've tamped this thing down from the very beginning, probably fearing that the public couldn't handle it. My feeling is that the public has been ahead of the government on this all along. And, when the government was attributing these phenomena to, swamp gas or the planet Venus, people who knew what they had seen, people, often veterans of World War II, let's say, And they were looking at craft with flashing lights and windows, and they got close-up views of these things, knew what they were looking at, and it was laughable what they thought, what the government was trying to put over on them. So the people have been ahead of the government. The government has a long history of trying to downplay this for various reasons, some related to defense, et cetera. But, I also wanted to say that there's so many variables in the number of sightings. First of all, not everyone who sees a UFO reports it. Secondly, it depends on places like California, which leads the country, the U.S., in sightings, is probably because more people are outdoors there because of the weather. I did a story on this for the New York Times some years ago on a big, thick book that tracked the sightings, the shape, the time of day, the county. So there's a lot of data there. It's hard to parse, but there's a lot of information. And my quarrel, by the way, with some of the so-called skeptics is that they have not done their homework. They have a quick answer to everything, but they haven't looked through the tremendous amount of literature and reports and scientific reports that have come out on this issue. So if you're going to be a skeptic or a debunker, at least do the homework and look into it, which I did for my book.
Daniel, I wonder if I could get you to weigh in on, we got liberals in power now in Ottawa, but 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, I guess now, it was conservatives in power. How well are either party in government in Canada doing at being transparent on this?
I think opaque is a better word than transparent. I don't get the sense that, for example, the Canadian government is hiding anything per se, but I think when it comes to UFOs, there's been official disinterest for decades. For example, in the work I've done, it's incredibly difficult to get responses from, government and military officials for the stories I'm doing. Documents are a little bit easier to pull in Canada if you know what you're looking for, but we don't have any politicians who are outspoken on the UFO issue in Canada like they do in the United States. For example, Florida Senator Marco Rubio has spoken very openly and very frequently about the UFO issue. And this is a person who is on the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee, which would mean that, he's privy to a lot more material than people in the public like you and I are.
Well, let me go to Amy on that. Yes, Marco Rubio, indeed, former, not just a senator, but ran for the Republican nomination against Donald Trump. He's been public about his interest in this. Harry Reid, the former Senate Majority Leader for the Democrats, has shown a great deal of interest in this subject when he was in public life. What do you make of all that?
That one I feel is a little bit hard to parse out. Politicians are always have some kind of angle, I feel, and I might, this is just my own thoughts. I feel like politicians always have an angle, whether it's bringing in money to their state or whether there's something that they personally want to see happen. And I think when we talk about UFOs and kind of politicians being vocal about UFOs, the other thing we kind of need to remember is that the military has long denied having technology and having programs in existence and kept them from even senators and congresspeople because of classification. So the idea of people kind of calling for money to unload these programs or release these programs isn't necessarily new, because there's always things that even the high-ranking politicians don't necessarily know. But there could be some rationale. These are all one thing. We're seeing Navy sightings. We're not seeing a lot of Air Force and FAA sightings, which are kind of the two groups that are looking for things in the air. So is there another thing? Because at the end of the day, whatever happens with this report, if there is an influx of money going into the Pentagon or to the military to study these phenomena, that money is very real, even if the sightings turn out to not be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, let me follow up with Ralph on that, because I think I remember reading in your story the fact that now Harry Reid, the former Senate Majority Leader, is from Nevada, and he had a friend in Nevada who was interested in this subject, and therefore the Senate Majority Leader was helping to fund the work of his friend. Now, how much of that is what's really going on here, and how much of it is Harry Reid is really interested in UFOs?
Well, let's name the friend. It's Robert Bigelow, who's an aerospace pioneer. He's got a module flying around with the International Space Station. He's a billionaire. He has funded anomalous research in many ways, including a ranch in Utah that is home to a lot of spooky phenomena, Skinwalker Ranch. So Bigelow, has a legitimate interest in the subject and the resources to do that. He was picked as the main contractor to do some of this research. But let me also say that the Navy now is encouraging people and the Pentagon to come forward with stories, which they never did before. Now that's something new, and that represents a break with the past, that they want military people to report these encounters for the first time. And that shows, I think, a significant change in the posture of the Defense Department.
Chris, if there ever were a president who was going to blow the lid on this thing, I think it was, as Joe Biden describes him, the former guy. Donald Trump wasn't a big fan of following the typical procedures of government and so on. In your view, did he reveal any information about UFOs more than he should have or more than he might have wanted to?
I don't think that Trump did, no. In fact, I think there's been much more interest in what Barack Obama said very recently about UFOs on, I think it was on an American talk show. The political thing is very interesting. I mean, in Canada, there have been a number of politicians over the years who've gone on record about UFOs. In fact, in House of Commons debates, UFOs have been brought up more than 45 times if you go through the Hansard. Former Governor General Ed Schreier actually challenged the Royal Canadian Air Force a number of times on its position on UFOs, demanding to know what's being done about it and so forth. So there are politicians in Canada as well who are interested. I recently was interviewed with Pamela Wallin. There's a few others that have contacted me over the years. It's something that I think is percolating in the back of everybody's mind. But whether it's going to be revealed, I think a lot of people think this disclosure idea is going to be telling everybody what's really going on behind the scenes with regard to the government. I'm not entirely sure. I agree with Daniel that perhaps nothing is being done really, but there are black projects that we don't have any privy information on. So maybe even this particular intelligence report isn't going to get to the bottom of it.
Daniel, let me get you to follow up on that in this regard. I've had conversations with a former cabinet minister named Paul Hellyer, who's a man, he's still around, he's in his late 90s now, I think, but he was defense minister back in the 60s. He represented the Liberals and the Conservatives, actually, in Parliament, and he was absolutely convinced that UFOs exist. He went to conferences on it, I recall, back in the day. Do you know any other politicians in Canada who've championed this issue?
Well, one thing I should mention about Mr. Hellyer, his interest in UFOs was developed after his time in office.
Yes.
So when he was sitting as minister, he was, he's readily admitted this himself, that he was not engaged in this issue. I've had politicians in Canada quietly reach out to discuss the matter, but really there's in parliaments right now, in Ottawa right now, doesn't seem to be anyone who's willing to be as outspoken on this topic as some of the politicians in the United States. In addition to Rubio, there's Senator Mark Warner, Obama has made comments, John Podesta, former CIA Director John Brennan. In the U.S., the list of prominent people who are speaking about this goes on and on. Right now here in Canada, it's mostly silence.
Ralph, I think, sorry, somebody wanted to jump in there?
I want to jump in because this may be counterintuitive, and it may sound crazy, but presidents don't necessarily know. They don't have a need to know. Often they don't want to know. They have enough to deal with. And from our research, we know that the information is squirreled away in secret, parts of the government, special access programs that require a very high degree of security clearance to get into. And even presidents have not had direct access to these programs. If they insisted and wanted to know, we heard George H.W. Bush was one of those because he had a background at the CIA. But since then, I can't think of any president who has, really probed into this area and gotten either wanted to get answers or gotten any answers. So, popular conception might be if he's president, he can know anything. That may be true, but in reality, they have not.
Chris, we are having, I think, a serious conversation about a serious subject tonight among the five of us here. But the reality is, oftentimes in popular culture, this issue is portrayed in, any number of different ways. And I see up there on the shelf behind you, you've got The Martian from, oh my gosh, what cartoon was that from now? I'm blanking.
Well, from Bugs Bunny.
Oh, from Bugs Bunny. There we go. That's right. Yeah. So, and you've got, movies, Independence Day, you've got the X-Files, you've got all sorts of things that, that certainly don't necessarily portray this issue in the most serious of fashions. Has that prevented agencies of government and politicians from taking this issue more seriously?
Well, there's no question it has. The reality is that the concept of UFOs and aliens has been very pervasive in our culture for many years. We live in the James Cameron universe where we assume aliens are out there. But that actually also drives scientists to pursue the subject of aliens and UFOs. In fact, I have many colleagues in physics and astronomy who have gotten into the subject because they're curious about the possibility of life out there. And there's many master's and doctoral theses that are published every year on the subject of UFOs and aliens across North America and around the world. So science is taking the subject seriously. It's just that our popular culture presents it in a way that is less so. So I think we have to acknowledge that, but at the same time recognize that there is seriousness. And whether it's aliens or foreign powers sending incursions into our airspace, or perhaps some technical difficulties with radar and infrared sensors and that type of thing. In any of those situations, I think it's definitely worthwhile pursuing. And I think hopefully this congressional investigation, or the Senate Intelligence report, will spur some of that.
Down to our last few minutes here, and Amy, let me get you to weigh in on this. What if there's actually conclusive proof that UFOs exist, that they're not unidentified anymore, they are genuinely aliens? Okay, then what?
Awesome. I think that would be a very interesting thing to come of it. Not sure that's what we're going to get from this report, but I think it would be really, really interesting. And I think, the science mind in me is just like, great, cool, let's understand that. Now it's no longer unidentified. Now we get to identify it and learn about it, which can never be a problem. So I think if we do kind of get anything conclusive out of this report, and even if what we get out of this report is just kind of a central database of all of the sightings from across the military and civilian reports, to kind of have this database to where we can go to things and we can match up sightings and actually try to understand it and get a better understanding of what people are seeing in the sky. I think that's also a great thing to come of it. I think no matter what happens, it could probably be a good thing for the sake of studying what we do see in the sky.
Daniel, if we're not the only ones out there, okay, then what?
Honestly, to me, I feel like when we start talking about aliens and ET, it sort of detracts from this conversation. The stories I write deal with credible observers like military personnel and professional aviators who have genuinely been seeing weird things in our skies for decades. And all of those could have conventional explanations. I'm perfectly willing to admit that. But as a society, when people make reports of this nature, we've sort of ridiculed them or dismissed them. But we need more people like this to come forward. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is by, normalizing the conversation, which will hopefully lead to, more and better data from witnesses, which could hopefully lead to answers. And if it's all conventional in the end, if it's all prosaic, I think that's just fine. But what we really need to do is take it seriously, and as a society, accept that, these observations are real. And the only way we're going to get answers is if we take it seriously and study it.
Ralph, in our last minute, sum it up for us. If the truth is out there, then what?
Look, we can't get ahead of ourselves. We cannot equate UFOs and aliens. And the government has been very clear on this, that they are looking into, what these objects are, their aerodynamics, trying to duplicate it, if it can be duplicated for ourselves, and keep it away from our adversaries. But no one in the government is talking about aliens. And in our reporting in the New York Times, we've been very careful, not to draw that inference that these things are operated by aliens. We just don't know. So it's very important to keep that separate. There are people who've had experiences, but how they're related to UFOs, we don't know. So let's keep our eye on the ball. Let's try to figure out what these things are. Gather all the data, as we said. Let science take a good look, and then take it from there, one step at a time.
That's Ralph Blumenthal, along with Amy Shira-Title, Chris Rutkowski, and Daniel Otis. Great of all of you to spend so much time with us on TVO tonight discussing this. We're really grateful. Take care, everybody.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.